Steel Force is a Morgan hypercoaster at Dorney Park in Allentown, Pennsylvania. And I know this coaster is often ridiculed by enthusiasts for being among the tamest coasters over 200 feet in height. But I genuinely enjoy Steel Force, and I think it's a bit underrated. Steel Force is one of 3 Morgan hypercoasters Cedar Fair built in the late 1990s. The first one was Wild Thing at Valley Fair in 1996, Steel Force was the second in 1997, and Mamba at Worlds of Fun was the third in 1998. And these coasters share a lot of similarities between them. Steel Force and Mamba stats are nearly identical. They have the same drop height in 205 feet, the same max speed at 75 miles per hour, and the same track length in 5,600 feet. The only difference is that Steel Force is 5 feet shorter than Mamba at 200 feet. Wild Thing is eerily similar too. That coaster stands 207 feet tall with a 196 foot drop, a 74 mile per hour max speed, and 5,460 feet of track. Not only that, but all 3 coasters follow an almost identical course. You have a painstakingly slow lift, a large drop, a large camelback, a large turnaround section, a mid-course brake run that can make or break your ride, and a series of bunny hills on the way back to the station. For that reason, the trio of Cedar Fair hypers are often lumped together. However, that isn't quite fair to Steel Force. All 3 coasters have solid outward legs and turnaround sections, but both Wild Thing and Mamba die at the mid-course brake run. Those 2 coasters bring the train to an almost halt. That results in the return run having absolutely no airtime. If those airtime hills on the return run actually had airtime, Mamba and Wild Thing would be great rides. Compare that to Steel Force, where the return leg is the ride's strength. While the mid-course very loudly does trim the train, Steel Force still has a considerable amount of speed coming off the mid-course brake run. The return run has some excellent airtime, but more on that later. Steel Force is located in the very back corner of Dorney Park, and it dominates the park's skyline. No matter where you are in the park, you can see Steel Force's hulking structure. And I love this coaster's entrance plaza. First off, Steel Force has one of my favorite logos of any coaster. I love the menacing looking robot Phantom hybrid. And in fact, this logo was originally supposed to be used as Cedar Point in 1996 for Mantis. When it was originally announced in the late 1995, Mantis was supposed to be called Banshee, but the name was heavily criticized for its negative connotation. So, Cedar Point changed the name to Mantis, and that logo was reused for Steel Force a year later. But what I find really interesting is that Cedar Fair decided to revive the Banshee name for the Inverted Kings Island 2 decades later, but that's another story for another day. Back to Steel Force, I love how the finale passes above the entrance plaza because you'll hear the excited cheers of riders as you make your way through the queue. And more often than not, you will not have to wait for this coaster. Steel Force is a capacity machine. The park always runs 2 to 3 trains in this hypercoaster and rarely stacks them. That holds true even on the quietest of days. And that's one of the biggest strengths of Dorney Park in my opinion. It's their dedication to running their rides at their maximum capacities even if the crowds probably don't warrant it. Now let's talk about the restraints. This is another major strength for Steel Force. On most hypercoasters, you have a very snug lap bar pressed firmly against your lap. And it makes sense considering the amount of airtime these coasters usually deliver. But on Steel Force, you have a seatbelt with a lot of give in it, and a lap bar that'll probably rest a good 1.5 inches above the lap of most riders. I'm always in disbelief how high the lap bar rests at its lowest setting in Steel Force. And to that point, some seats have lap bars that do lower further than others. So if you want to maximize your airtime, take note of specific rows in each train that may have a tighter lap bar. Once dispatched, you slowly climb the 200-foot lift hill. It takes almost a minute to climb this lift. Compare that to the nearby Candemonium at Hershey Park that takes only 28 seconds to clear its lift. But I don't mind too much because you get an amazing view of Dorney Park. When you crest the lift, the chain gets even slower. So if you ride up front, you're held over the crest for an unnaturally long amount of time. In a way, Steel Force's drop feels a bit like a dive coaster. And that drop is very good. The drop takes its sweet time reaching its max angle of descent, so you get some wonderful sustained floater airtime in the back row. And for all those people nicknaming Steel Force as Steel Forceless, I have to admit that pullout from the first drop has some pretty strong positive Gs. After rocketing through a tunnel, you fly over a giant camelback. This camelback has 3 to 4 seconds of sustained floater airtime. But even by floater airtime standards, the strength of this airtime is on the weaker side. But I personally don't mind too much because it's a sustained moment for so long. That's followed by another camelback delivering a similar dose of weak but sustained floater airtime. But unlike the prior hill, this one doesn't have a full drop on the other side. Instead, it leads into Steel Force's turnaround helix. And this is the best part of the ride to appreciate the coaster's speed. You haul through this element, getting decent laterals along the way because it feels a bit underbanked. Plus, there are some terrifying head choppers as well. Now, Steel Force as a whole is a very smooth coaster. There are a few bumps here and there, but overall, very smooth. However, there is one brutal moment in the turnaround section, and that's the sharp turn into the mid-course brake run. This turn is ridiculously tight, so while it offers some great laterals, this element jackhammers quite badly. I dreaded this moment on every single one of my rides. The ascent into the mid-course gives some good airtime. As I mentioned earlier, I usually leave this brake run with a good amount of speed. I've visited Dorney Park several times over the past 15 years, but not once have I been brought to a near stop as I have on Mamba or Wild Thing. I usually fly through this brake run. As a result, the return run is pure bliss. The drop off the brake run gives some strong flagector airtime for back row riders. And then you're treated to an airtime buffet. And each hill increases in strength. The first bunny hill is sustained floater airtime. The second bunny hill is sustained flagector airtime. And the third bunny hill is where it gets wild. Just look at how the profiling atop the hill changes from parabolic to triangular. The final two hills remind me of the profiling of the bunny hills on Magnum XL 200's return run, because of just how sharp the tops of these hills are. Rather than the sustained floater airtime of the prior two hills, the third hill abruptly launches you skyward. The ejector airtime pop catches you off guard after all the floater airtime that preceded it throughout Steel Force. And the fourth hill is even more abrupt. Because of how short this hill is, you aren't thrown up like most airtime hills. Rather, you're thrown forward horizontally. It's a really wild moment. And if you're up front, this is followed by another quick hop. So you get two of these horizontal airtime moments back to back. It feels like a bucking bull if you're riding Steel Force up front during this element. It's that out of control feeling the other Cedar Fair Morgan hypers lack. Steel Force then zips around the station and over the queue line before coming to a loud stop on the brakes, because remember, Steel Force still has a considerable amount of speed at this point. So what would I rate Steel Force? Believe it or not, I'd give this ride an 8.5 out of 10. I really think this is an underrated hypercoaster. I think Steel Force is unfairly lumped together with Mamba and Wild Thing, two coasters ruined by the mid-course brake run. Steel Force does not have that issue. As a result, Steel Force is an airtime buffet from start to finish. And I love how the airtime gets even wilder with each hill. I love when coasters save their best for last so you hit the brake run breathless. Steel Force is easily my favorite attraction at Dorney Park, and in all honesty, I prefer it to a large chunk of the B&M hypercoasters. What are your thoughts on Steel Force? Do you agree this is the best of the Cedar Fair Morgan hypers, or have you gotten some disappointing rides on it? I'd love to hear your comments down below about Steel Force. If you enjoyed this review, I'd appreciate it if you gave this video a like and considered subscribing, because we'll have a lot more roller coaster and amusement park videos here at Canopy Coaster. Thanks for listening.